And welcome to Office Hours. It feels like a long time since we've done a theme session, but I'm sure it's not that long. I think it's just all the things we've probably done in the meantime. Anyway, this month we are going to talk about how you might collect information that lives outside of Salesforce and bring it into Salesforce. And there are a variety of different form tools and connectors, some of which we are going to talk about today. So, because this is a topic session, really we're not taking general questions today. We are taking questions specifically about form tools and your experience with that and collecting information. As usual, with Office Hours, however, if you do have a question for the panel, please put it in the chat first, and then we can see what's coming up. I'd like to remind everybody that we are all volunteers. None of us work for Salesforce.org, but we're here because we like to share our enthusiasm and our Salesforce talents with you all. So thank you very much to the panel for giving up the time, and particularly Brennan, because she was only told about this yesterday. She was voluntold yesterday, so thank you for leaping in at the last minute. So roughly, what are we going to talk about? So TJ had a topic which I think it would be a good place to start, which is actually about if you are collecting data about people, make sure you're collecting the right data. So I think TJ is going to talk to us a little bit about being mindful of people's preferences and how you refer to gender and various other bits of information. And then we'll take a sort of dig into the tools. Between us, between everybody, I think we are able to talk about some of the dedicated form tools. Principally, we're going to talk about FormAssembly, but there will also be mention of FormStack and any of the others that any of you have known and know and love or don't love. Please let us know and join in the conversation. And then in the last part, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the other ways that you can do this if you don't have a dedicated form tool. There is basic web to lead in Salesforce, but there are also some other tools that you can use as a connector between other kinds of form tools. And I think Barbara's going to talk to us, tell us a little bit about some of the ones she's used, Zapier and the Gravity connector and various things. All will become clearer as we go through. So that's basically it. We'll start to talk a bit about data first, then we'll talk about the dedicated form tools, and then we'll talk about some of the other options. So that's quite enough from me. And if there's a lot of noise in the background where I am, I'm sorry, they're actually building our backdoor steps today, deck and various things, which is very exciting. So TJ, do you want to get us going? Because you'd suggested this idea of sort of thinking about, as you're collecting information, what's the appropriate or the right information to collect. So what did you have in mind about this?
Yeah, is there a way to make me the presenter so I could share my screen?
Will, absolutely.
So while we do that, I did this presentation for the Transform Tech conference, the first one 2 years ago, put on by the Transgender Law Center, about the proper way to collect data and to only collect that data that you actually need. So are you viewing my screen that says collecting names?
Yep.
Okay, great. I'm sharing the right screen. And a lot of people will say like, oh, we don't have a need for that. And I'm a perfect example of why you do have a need for that. TJ is not my legal name. And but I go by TJ. I've gone by TJ for over a decade. I've never gone through the process of legally changing it, but TJ is my name. And you'll be surprised at how many people actually assume TJ is a Mr. When I had when I was hiring for a position, I would get phone calls and emails of, oh, Mr. TJ Warfield, and that affects how that person that you're communicating with is going to respond to you. I get mail to Mr. TJ Warfield. So how you collect the information and then what you do with it and the assumptions you make actually make a big difference. So with the prefix, there's still a lot of forms that require a prefix. And in this day and age, really take a look at that and why are you gathering a prefix? Consider using pronoun instead of prefix. And if you have to create a prefix, maybe not make it required. And if you make it required, make sure you offer some gender neutral options. And then name. Think about name and how you're using the name. There are some instances where a legal name is actually necessary, especially in healthcare. If you're maybe internships where you have to set up some legal documentation. I have some nonprofits that have some youth where they schedule travel where they need the legal name. And in those times where you gather the legal name, make sure you also offer them an option to give you the name that they go by. And a lot of people say like, oh, what is your preferred name? And I've talked to some folks that is, it puts them off because it's not the preferred name, it's their name, it's what they go by. So maybe say go by a different name and not use the preferred name. Think about the pronouns instead of like Mr. or Mrs. And offer options for pronouns. Either have a pick list or like write in. There is an app that I forgot, Beth, she works for .org now, created that creates that takes the text value and turns it into a pick list. So if you need to do reporting and stuff, but think about how you're using that information, both internally and externally. And this goes for staff too. You don't want to put your constituents and your staff in danger by using data that they're not comfortable with you using. So make sure you think about these things as you're creating your forms and doing all these things. So, and think about how you're going to use it. Are you going to use it externally or internally? Because those are going to have some different needs and ways that you want to process that information. Especially internally with org charts, make sure that you go by that name that they want to go by so that you don't accidentally share information that isn't yours to share. So as you're building all of these forms and gathering information, whether it's offline, online, really think about how you're using that data and only gather the data that you actually need. I have a lot of nonprofits that are, and we did the same thing when I was a nonprofit. It's like, we're going to gather all the information because we might need it at some point in the future. And that's not really the best way to gather information. Gather the information that you need and that you're going to use and use it deliberately.
Wow. That's a really interesting thing about the preferred name, because I see a lot of people use that. It's interesting that you got the feedback that preferred is kind of, people get offended by you saying preferred.
Yeah, because they think of their legal name as it's just there as the legal name.
Yeah.
And it's not their preferred name. It's not what they prefer. It's their name to them.
Yeah.
And it's the legal name is just something there that exists that they have to use on legal forms, and that's the only time that they use it. And so saying preferred name is, I have been told by many, and especially my LGBTQ organizations, that is a non-preferred way of gathering that information.
Yeah, it's interesting. I wonder what other people use as the way of, oh, insert click off like button. Thank you, Ryan. Yeah, because there's also that, I mean, people sometimes have that idea of informal name, and to some extent that sort of sounds even worse, doesn't it? I think.
Yeah, and it's name and legal name is really the best way to do it. Like, what's your name and what's your legal name?
Yeah.
So that, because when you say what's your legal name, that also puts some expectations around how they're going to use that piece of data. That the legal name means that you're going to be using that in ways that just requires that like legal formal information, and that your name is really just how they're going to communicate with you.
That's great. Thank you for that, for getting us started in that way. So let's pivot a little, because actually it's interesting. So Salesforce, we have a lot of information that we keep about people in Salesforce, but it is kind of interesting to think about how you can gather more of that information without having to actually manually enter it or to update it, or import it. And there's also the question of how you keep people's preferences up to date. And I think it's one of those things that people, when they start out with Salesforce, very quickly find a need for, isn't it? Is how can we have something that maybe is linked to our website or some kind of external tool, so actually we can get more information about people, and we can allow them to update their information without us having to kind of sit there and do all of this manually. So there are some extremely good dedicated tools for collecting forms. I'm trying to shift this way and leave web to lead till later, but we can come back to it. But
it could be last.
Because yes, out of the box, the options for collecting information are somewhat limited. We'll talk about those in a moment. But I think, but I suspect a lot of the reason why people are here is because they want to see, okay, so what could we really get into, and what could we really do if we had a very a specific and customized and dedicated way of collecting information using form tools. So I think so. Most of these dedicated form tools work in quite similar ways, but I'm also kind of now nudging towards Brennan, because I think she's the one who's been kind of voluntold to talk about FormAssembly, which I know everyone has used, but I think but you've got the demo lined up. So FormAssembly, I mean, FormAssembly isn't the only option, but it is probably the favorite amongst many of us who work with a lot of nonprofit clients. So Brennan, are you okay to kind of take over and give us a little bit of an introduction to what FormAssembly is and what it's all about? And you should have just got a request to...
if I click the right button, I'll be able to share my screen.
So, I mean, FormAssembly, it is something that you can access from Salesforce, but it is a third-party app, isn't it? It's a separate tool. It has separate licensing. It is something that you have to apply for an account for. Yeah, we're still waiting to...
Sorry, I have to add an extension.
Yes, quick download, I think. Which meeting might be a slow download. Sorry, please go ahead, TJ. Aha,
she's got it going. I was going to say, while she gets that loaded, we can talk a little bit about pricing, but she's got it all going. So,
am I sharing my screen yet?
Yes, you are.
We can see your screen.
And you're seeing and FormAssembly, right?
Yes, absolutely. So do the marketing pitch first, and then later on we'll freak everybody out about how much it costs. But let's convince them it's a great tool first.
Okay. Yes, it is an expensive tool, but it's a fabulous tool. And I really wish I could have done like a client instance on this, because some of these forms are what we took from a client instance. So you have your form and you build a form. It's drag and drop, and they have upgraded FormAssembly in the past, 6 months? So like, you didn't used to have this. And this is one of the most fabulous things I have ever seen in my life. And I know it looks really crazy, but you have what your field name is on your layout, and you have your field ID. And these field IDs can be pre-populated with Salesforce info if you have this ID. And because this is here, you don't have to do 5 different clicks and go back and forth to pre-populate that data. So I went a little bit beyond where I wanted to go with that. Anyway, so on here, bouncing off of what TJ said, on this form, we do not collect a prefix at all. So it's first name and last name. And the reason we have the first name, last name on here and not a preferred name is because for this document, it belongs to one of our orgs that links to legal documentation. So the first name and last name are being pushed onto legal documentation. So it has to be their legal first name and legal last name for that documentation to be legal. Then that's something I want to actually point out is sometimes for organizations, you do have to do reporting to the government, and they haven't quite caught up on their forms for gender identity. So you also want to make sure you have the options in here for the ones that match government forms, male and female. And then you can add your others in a separate box if you'd like to collect those. But if they are going to government forms, or you have to report on specific items for grants, then you're going to need to have the ones that match your government forms. You can easily make things required by a click of a button, add choices, and then for this one, this is actually conditional. Why it's not showing on here? I want to show this. So you have conditional fields on here where you can, so I was just reading the chat, my bad. Go to options, and then you pick out, I don't want presentation. There are a lot of options in here. So your validation rules. Can y'all tell this is last second? Here we go. This is where the conditional rules are held, and you just click edit, and you can pick any fields you want, as many conditions as you want. And then it will be marked as a conditional field, because right here you can see this. If we go into preview, you would not be able to see this unless those conditions are meant to show it.
And a really cool use case for conditional fields, I just had this conversation yesterday with a client where we thought we were going to have to daisy chain 5 or 6 different forms depending on a status on an account to show the proper fields. And we realized that we could just do that with one form with a conditional pick list of based on the status on this account. If it's this status, show these fields. If it's this status, show these fields. So it really streamlines both your form, but then the user's experience as well.
Yeah,
right, and that's one thing we're actually going to be doing with these forms is they're going to start allowing minors to volunteer. So there's going to have to be another question up here about age, and then like all the military related questions would disappear because you can't serve if you're under 18. There'd be no need for them to see them, but don't have to do the whole form again.
And that's cool, isn't it? Because the other thing is that you can see you've got some groups, haven't you? You've got some groups and some sections, and you can kind of group in your people don't need to see that things are necessarily in a section or a group, but you can put the fields together, can't you? So that you can conditionally show a whole group of fields. Yeah.
And you can even come in here and play with the HTML and make it look more like you want it to. Like you can put a break in here so that there is more of a space between your two fields. You can only do that though on your titles or your group headings. Like you can't go into here and mess with the HTML.
And as Michael, thank you. Yes, Michael, also for reminding us that you can use these conditionals not just to display fields, but also to whether you put some text in as well, pre-filled text. Thank you.
And you can also upload pictures and all the fun stuff.
That's a trick that I see happen a lot is if you have a form that's pulling data from Salesforce, you really can make these completely contextual forms where I drop in that the account is a nonprofit or the account is a client or, and then the form will actually display it. It almost looks like an entirely different form, but it's all built on the same form, which just makes life easier for admins to not have to manage 4 forms that have, 60% of the same content instead of, you can put them all in the same form and have them display contextually. It's really helpful. But then again, you have to have the pre-fill connector.
Right. The client we have does have the pre-fill connector, which is why I was really sad when I don't get to show their org. But from these forms, you can go into the connectors, which is the plug, and go to configure. And from the configure tab, this is how you get your information into Salesforce and get information from Salesforce. So on this one, we are creating a new contact record because the only people who get this form have never been put in their system before. So if this were going to people who you might just need an update from, you would do a lookup for the contact that matches the information that's been put in. And then even with FormAssembly, if you're sending them a link to their email address, you can do a URL hack that will pre-populate that information and look it up for them. So like for this form, in the org that it's used for, we have it linked to 5 URL hacks that walk people through an entire process of filling out waivers, so that it pre-fills all their information, it pulls their contact ID from Salesforce, and it links everything back. So that if they go to the contact record in Salesforce, they click on a link and they get brought right into the signed documentation for their participants and volunteers. This has actually been updated in their instance. You can create. Oh, go ahead, Caroline.
Oh, this is Barbara. Somebody asked about URL hacks. Judy, thank you. Yeah, I was going to pipe in too. A URL hack, can you open the form itself in preview mode?
Yep.
Just so we can show. So a form, it lives in FormAssembly. Forms can live in many ways. They can be published in several ways, one of which is the form can actually live on a website. See, this is TFA forms for 609540. If you put a slash after that and a question mark, you are telling that URL that you are about to pass it some very important data. And you can actually tell it which fields you want to put a certain piece of information into. So right now, Brenna's typing TFA_1 equals, and you've basically said that the field that is called TFA_1, and we'll go back and look where she found that, equals any piece of text information. So you could pre-build a link. This is something we do a lot with forms where you have on your campaign in Salesforce, we have pre-built a link that does this for us. It gives us the link to the form TFA equals or TFA_1 equals, and then we grab some data from Salesforce and pre-fill it like the first name or the last name, so that when I open the form, it's going to come pre-filled with that data. So if you refresh this, is there a field called TFA_1?
There is a TFA1. I have no clue if it's actually on
on the layout.
on this layout. Or if it's 1_ or 2. I think there's actually more a little bit more you have to do. Oh, yes.
There you go. So you have to learn how how to write the hack, but in general, see how she pre-filled that data. So that is, quote, a URL hack. URL hacks are used in all sorts of things, but in the FormAssembly context, that's what you can do. So you could, in an email, send someone to your pre-filled hacked URL that puts their name in their donate page for them already. Suggests an amount to donate if you're using FormAssembly for your donations. Like, you can do a lot of stuff with those hacks.
Yes. One thing that we do with them is, again, send them through a waiver process that pulls in information from their contact information into those waivers, so they don't have to keep typing continuously. And then they have to go back and submit, and FormAssembly has a signatory. I probably pronounced that horribly wrong.
E-signature. Try that.
E-signature. We will go with that. Where it's actually a legal signature, and it can be held inside FormAssembly, and you can put that information into Salesforce.
Yeah, and these URL hacks aren't specific to FormAssembly. Most form tools you can use form hacks with the same format of the question mark, form field name equals whatever. You just want to be careful if you're not using pre-fill, which we can talk about a little bit later, to be very deliberate with what you're putting in there, especially if you're putting it in an email or something that's not secure, to not share too much personal information in there. Never, ever, ever put any type of true personal information in there that you could get legally in trouble with. But also think, is putting their name and address in there something. If they forward that email to someone, is sharing that name and address appropriate? So kind of think about what you put in there as well.
Yeah, very good. Can you go back to the connector, I think, and let's look at it a little more I was thinking maybe to look a little more at the connector before we get too much into pre-fill, because it's not just contact pages, is it, that you can, or contact?
No, we do so much with the connectors. So you have a couple of options on the form being opened and after the form is submitted, and then the form being submitted. So like this one will happen exactly on when they hit the submit button.
And it's important to pay attention to that, because if you have your Salesforce connector on submit and there's any Salesforce errors, your user will see those errors and not be able to continue. So most of the time you're going to want to put your Salesforce connector after submit so that the user sees it go through, excuse me, but any Salesforce or sync errors you can deal with after the fact and they can still submit their submission.
Right, and that's why this one is in particularly on submit or at submit, is because we didn't want their users to see those errors. And then their internal org handles them as they come in. And it's normally like they missed the last name, they just missed a required field, something very simple. From here, you can.
So yeah, do you have any related objects with the contact on this form?
In real life, we do. Not in our demo org, which if you see me, I keep trying to like pull up here because I keep wanting to log out and go to the actual form because it's really cool. And I think I'm actually going.
That has multiple related objects, Carolyn. If
I think I'm going to do it. We don't hold any information there. Like we don't have any client information. But I want to show you what we actually do.
Yeah, because I think that would be useful to see is because this is true again, isn't it, of a lot of the tools that you can actually, as well as just pushing data into something like contact or account, you can actually relate to a bunch of different objects. So it would just be great to get an idea of what else you can do with it. And yes, we are recording this, Alex, so it will be available.
So like what this form does in reality, this is actually their volunteer contact form, which is very similar to their participant. So this one is looking up let me go to the actual participant one. I'm so used to going to that main one. Yes. Doing the volunteer one, it has more cool stuff. And this is another thing. You can clone these and it gives you so many of them.
There is a level of FormAssembly that lets you archive and have teams and folders, but they're out of the box, they're basic level. Yeah, you have got one big pile and one login.
There we go. Connectors.
And yeah, I think Elizabeth,
okay, it's all here.
Yeah, so let's look at these connected, and then we will come back to Elizabeth's question, which is about handling donations via FormAssembly, because I think that's a useful thing to talk about a little bit. So sorry to interrupt. Go ahead, Brennan.
That's okay, because they don't do donations through FormAssembly at this point. But what we do here is we are looking up a response ID for a form based off of the participant or based off of the volunteer. So if they already have a FormAssembly response ID in Salesforce, it's checking for that so that we don't create a duplicate contact on this form. Then if it doesn't find a match, a new record is created. If one match, it updates it. If there are multiple matches, it creates a new record. And you can pick how these go through. Then you also get to map all your fields. This is the boring part. We get to the fun stuff down here. We map a lot in this form. All right. And then from all of that, we create a feed item. So on the chatter feed in Salesforce, they get to see their volunteer's photo and the description based off the photo. I forget what this field is, so I can't remember what that actually tells us. I think that is their bio. So right when they're opening that contact in Salesforce, they see the person's bio and their photo.
And are those things that is the photo something that they could upload in the form?
Yes, so the photo is uploaded in the form.
Cool.
Because what they're doing with this is they are registering to either volunteer to take people on outings or to be a participant to go on outings. So having that photo available is really helpful when they start to meet in person and they know what people look like. They know who they're looking for. This also will look up an account, and it's going to look up an account based off a program name, which is a question in the form, and connect a volunteer to the program so that then it creates an affiliation record of their role and their current status. So if they're an active volunteer, a former volunteer, and their volunteer role. And there are about 5 different volunteer roles they can be that they would select on that form.
And I think the interesting...
This is another...
And sorry, I was just going to say, because I think the interesting bit of mapping in those affiliations is to show people is how you can look up the ID of the contact. It's great because even if it's a newly created by FormAssembly contact, you can still get the ID, can't you?
Yes, and it's all based on, so when you're doing these, think of like with a formula with order of operations. So as long as it's underneath where you need to get the information from, you can look up anything from the previous step. Does that make sense? I don't think anybody's going to answer, but okay.
I'll answer if you like. Yes, it does. Thank you.
And then we create is this the same affiliation? So these people can possibly have 2 affiliations because they have 2 levels of volunteers. So it checks for a second level for an affiliation, which is right here, and creates that affiliation as well. Go ahead.
Oh, it might be good also when we're done to close up the form a little bit so you can see the levels on sort of a higher
right.
And so the details, it might be interesting so people can see the way you can outline it.
And that's all this is. This is creating a contact record or looking up and updating a contact record and then creating those affiliations so that this org can start to report on how many program leads they have, how many, I forget all the names of their volunteers. But they can report throughout their system who is doing what and know exactly where everybody is. So let's close these up. And you do the close up just by clicking on the little doohickeys. And this is just going to be a long lot of scrolling.
So,
Okay.
So what are some other use? I mean, I know people use FormAssembly. Often they can bring in donations and things like that. Barbara, have you got kind of other use cases? Because I mean, you can use FormAssembly with any custom object or really any sort of structure that you've built in Salesforce, can't you?
Sure, and there are all sorts of integrations with FormAssembly other than Salesforce. We've been chatting in chat a little bit about payment connectors. So there are payment connectors that work, and Elizabeth, Chargent does actually pass Salesforce data to Salesforce. I can chat with you a little bit when I'm done talking about that. So there are several payment connectors. Some do pass all the data you need to Salesforce, some might not. I only know Chargent and IATS and PayPal really well. And then you can use this. A lot of people use FormAssembly instead of Volunteers for Salesforce built-in forms. They send all the data Volunteers for Salesforce needs into the app in NPSP, but just it's a little bit more customizable. They like the way it looks better. That can be a little prettier. You don't have to have somebody who knows Visual Force. to make your pages prettier. I know a lot of people use it that way. I have built a full app, like you're seeing with Brennan right here, a full application process for an after-school girls in science program where all the application is on an iPad that they have at the first meeting, and the parents fill out, they fill out their first and last name, and it pulls up their record if they happen to be in Salesforce already, and then they fill out all the paperwork for their girls to join the form, and it builds the registration record. It builds any new contact and account, as needed, matching on email or matching on email and name, and then it builds out all the class structure right from inside FormAssembly. It's a complicated form, it's a complicated connector, but it isn't something that an admin with some gumption could totally do it. And lots of testing in a sandbox.
Yes. I just wanted to show this URL hack.
Yeah, thanks.
So that we could just round about to that real quick. If I click enter on this, it's actually not going to pre-fill this because I didn't fill out the previous form. But it would pre-fill all of this information. Mm-hmm. And then some of these, like the response ID, is a hidden field that nobody can see. Mm-hmm. And that's what we're using to connect it back to Salesforce to make sure all this information is connected. So that's the type of stuff you can do with a URL hack. And the reason we did it this way, even though we have a pre-fill connector, is that there was something to do with the form that it wouldn't allow us to get the ID we wanted with the pre-fill connector. So normally that would work with.
Go ahead.
Oh, you're good. I was done.
Okay. Other use cases for this, as aside from applications, donations, manage preference pages. If you don't have a full marketing automation tool, if you want to give folks an option other than just opt-in, opt-out, be able to give them like subscription statuses and have at the bottom of your page manage preference and be able to use that pre-fill to fill in what they're already subscribed to. Newsletter signups, if you have more robust ones there. What I have a couple of clients do, that they have volunteers or folks out in the field that they don't want full access into Salesforce. And so we'll create some data entry forms that they can share with seasonal volunteers or survey takers to be able to access anywhere, wherever they are, to do just data entry. You might have some volunteers that are entering paper forms, and you don't want them to Salesforce accidentally messing stuff up. You don't want to have multiple profiles and dealing with all of that and user licenses and transferring all of those. That they'll just create a simple, or sometimes they're not so simple, data entry forms to be able to get access directly into Salesforce with sometimes some automation built in without having those people in Salesforce actually messing with the data.
I think that's a really good thing, and it's interesting, isn't it? There's not only that, but as Barbara was saying about these kind of complicated forms, and sometimes it's an interesting way to actually guide an internal user through entering information, particularly if it covers multiple objects.
Yeah, I have a client that has business card entry FormAssembly forms for internal folks, so that all of the data goes to the right place and creates the correct affiliations and relationships, and that's for internal folks as well. And they're in Salesforce, but they have that one page so that that gets entered in a standard way.
So there are some other, we can come back to some more detailed questions, I think, about charging and the donation stuff. I wanted to make sure that we cover a few other things as well. So, I mean, FormAssembly, as we've kind of said, is one of our preferred form tools. There are some others as well. I mean, FormStack is often one that people go to. TJ, what's your experience? Has been your experience with FormStack?
Yes, so FormStack purchased Fast Forms. So if you're using Fast Forms or you have heard of Fast Forms is now FormStack. FormStack has two different versions. One is a connector type similar to FormAssembly that we just saw, but then they also have fast forms for Salesforce that actually lives in Salesforce, and you create your forms directly in Salesforce. And those forms, really all they do is collect data for Salesforce fields, and you can't really collect any other data that's not going into Salesforce, and sometimes you want to do that. With the Salesforce, the FormStack for Salesforce, it can get tricky though, because if you're doing lookups, the lookups get a little funky and give you access to all of the Salesforce data. So if you have like the account name and it's a lookup name, as you start typing, it gives you, like you're in Salesforce, gives you options that are matching the data as you're typing, which you might want not. That you don't want to open up your entire databases. People are just entering their own information. The connector version of it, very similar to FormAssembly, but not as robust. One of my biggest issues with FormStack is that unlike FormAssembly, where it can do lookups and connect to any object, any field, FormStack is limited to only the Salesforce standard external IDs. So you cannot do an account lookup based on the account name in FormStack. It is mind-boggling to me. I've fought with it so often, but you only have the standard external IDs. So you've got the actual ID, you've got the email, and it does open up like the contact name, but you don't have a lot of options for doing some of that back-end lookup and finding and matching on the back end. So I've had to build a lot of workarounds, especially around the account name, where they were collecting organization information, where it creates a new account, and I've had to create an automation that looks to see if it exists, attaches it, and then deletes the new one after. So FormStack has some very important limitations. So make sure if you're thinking about using FormStack, either the connector or the built-in into Salesforce, that you really think through how you're going to use it and what types of lookups and back-end stuff that you're going to want to do to make sure that you're not putting yourself in a tool that is going to limit you in the future, and you're going to have to build a whole bunch of weird workarounds on the Salesforce side of it.
So yes,
I have found a big difference between FormStack and FormAssembly, because I work with both of them, is the how you get your FormAssembly forms to connect to your sandbox. And then the same thing in FormStack is much harder to me, because you have to export and import, and it becomes fairly complicated, especially if you have larger forms and you make a lot of edits. Whereas with FormAssembly, you literally go in and you choose what org you're connected to. And correct me if I'm wrong, if I just haven't found it yet, if there is a way in FormStack to do that same thing.
Yeah, no.
Okay. I was really hoping there was a yes, you just haven't found it yet.
Sounds like FormAssembly FormStack is useful in the same way some of the other smaller connectors are, where maybe your best bet is to set it to a lead and then have, you don't have mass volume, have a human review it and put the data where it needs to end up. What it does best is post versus lookup.
So
and it does create it can create like related objects and stuff like that, but it has some serious lookup limitations. I work with FormStack because it's an existing tool, not because I recommend it, because it is cheaper than FormAssembly, and if you don't have a lot of those more complex needs, it's cheaper, and you can do some of those related objects things, and it'll connect to, like FormAssembly, it'll connect to Google Docs and Google Sheets and some of those external things as well. So the same form, Google Sheets and Salesforce. If you have like an events coordinator that only works in Google Sheets, you can have it post to both with both of these tools. But yeah, so FormStack is significantly more limited than FormAssembly, but significantly more cheaper.
Greg Devine, who's on the call, you wanted to talk briefly about FormTitan, because I know that that's another one that's out there. How some of these things that we've been talking about, how does FormTitan compare?
Okay, so first of all, I've been using FormAssembly for 6 or 7 years, and have got customers who love it. I love it, and does some really spectacular things. However, over the last 6 months, I've begun working with FormTitan, and like all these things, it's different. Okay, I've certainly had a good look at FormStack and found some limitations. So I didn't move any customers. There's a couple of key things that some of my customers have actually moved to FormTitan, and some new customers are going with FormTitan rather than FormAssembly. Now, there's not a criticism of FormAssembly. One of the key things is that from a pricing point of view, effectively the FormAssembly professional version is pretty similar price to the FormTitan version. FormTitan does have a free version, but the version that I'm putting in for many of my customers is the equivalent price. However, it actually has all, if not more, I'm sure there's something it doesn't have, the functionality of the FormAssembly Enterprise version, which the retail price is now, I think, $5.99 US.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Okay, okay, so I've been able to achieve, for example, and again, this is not a criticism, in terms of layout, in terms of, you don't have to write any CSS. You can do pretty much everything on a field level. You can say, well, actually change the font on the label of this particular field or this group of fields. What color font do you want? What size font? What sort of borders do you want? It's all just point and click, drag and drop. But more importantly, you can do some pretty amazing things with the links into Salesforce. And, I mean, at some stage, I can actually show people, get on a webcast and show people some real life examples of, doing some pretty amazing things.
Is this another of the form? Is this a form that you access it from within Salesforce? Do you download it into Salesforce?
No. And one of the interesting things, one of the customers that is using it, they were looking to go, they've been advised to go for one of these forms that's built within Salesforce. This tool to me has the best of both worlds. One of the challenges I have with FormAssembly is that as a consultant, yes, I understand the connectors, but the goal is many of the end users, I try and keep them right away from the connectors. So you try and do as much as possible in Salesforce, or a few sort of tricks pre-filled and things like that. The connectors, once you get used to it, look, it took me months to get used to it because it's such a completely different tool. And I'm so used to working in the FormAssembly paradigm. And now I flick between the two. So, any day I'll be working in both tools.
Great.
But the connectors are pretty powerful and very easy to set up.
That's fabulous. I'm a little conscious of time, but thank you very much for that, Greg. And it would be great. It would be lovely to dig in a bit more. So maybe we'll chat afterwards, and I can get you onto an office house.
People a separate, even off, not necessarily a big hub thing, but to anyone who's interested, I can do 20 minutes of the session, show you some real live forms and what the differences are.
So let me, I'll chat with you afterwards, because maybe we'll bring you into one of our general sessions, Greg, and you can come and do a demo for us, and that would be just great. Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. And in the meantime, if you wouldn't mind just posting a link so everybody catches the name of what we were just talking about. So kind of in the interest of time, I'm going to fly the presenter thing over to you, Barbara, because so there are these very sophisticated and more kind of fully functioned tool things, but then there are, people have other types of form builders, perhaps ones that they really like. So there are ways to get information out of some of these standalone ones and get it into Salesforce, aren't there?
Yes. So I'm going to talk really quickly about Zapier. I'm going to show you Zapier in the context of Percolator's own WordPress site. We have a very simple WordPress site, and I built this 5 years ago before I had any idea what I was doing. So it didn't take a lot of knowledge. Zapier wasn't part of it then, but I built this form very easily using a tool called Gravity Forms, which is a WordPress plugin, and many of your standard website platforms have these plugins. Gravity Forms is the one we chose to use. But in the back end, I am actually using something called Zapier to have my website talk to Salesforce. And Zapier is what is called middleware. There are several types of middleware out there. There's Zapier, there's Workato, there's... Oh, I just had a brain fart. It's morning. I'll think of the other ones. Kazumi, thank you. There's Dell... Boomi, is that their name now? There's a couple of them out there, but one of the ones that most people prefer is Zapier because it's a good price point. Workato, I would say, is the more powerful of the two major middlewares out there, but it is significantly more expensive. Zapier offers a good, nice middle ground for getting started. If you get more complicated than that, then you can go into a more complicated tool. Sorry, I accidentally jumped out of... and I'm in the wrong page. No wonder this doesn't make any sense. Okay, I jumped out of my page. So Zapier is a middleware builder, and middleware basically takes data from one place, transforms it, and sends it to another as needed. And so Zapier, in this case, is taking from Gravity, but I wanted to show us all the places Zapier can talk, just so you get an idea of where you can come from. You can come from Google Sheets, which for data entry, right? People who really want to do data entry in an Excel style format, they love this. But you can come, there's all these places that you can bring data from and put data to. Just so you understand the model, the companies themselves or Zapier themselves builds these connectors. So it's all up to whether or not they've built the type of connector you need. Like, so in Salesforce, there's only certain things you can do. But there's a lot of them, and there's always a list here of what it can do. But you can look up contacts, search for accounts, search for opportunities, post contacts, accounts, and opportunities, search for campaigns and add campaigns. You can't yet search for campaign members. I'm hoping they change that. But you get a decent amount of options for what you can do in Zapier. And then the builder in Zapier is pretty intuitive. You start with a trigger, the thing that happens on endpoint 1 that you want to trigger the action. In this case, somebody submits to my Gravity form, or somebody submits to my Google. Somebody mentioned about Google Forms. You could set that as your trigger. And then you have, and you basically just, you just basically walk through their little wizard. You say what you're trying to do. It gives you the ID that you're supposed to copy into Gravity Forms. It tells you what to do. You don't have to know anything about hooks, webhooks. And then you test the step. And Zapier then lets you go on to the next step. I've brought data in. The next thing I want to do is I only really want to move on if some rule is true. And for me, in this case, I'm looking for, I have 2 of these ones that says, oh, did the person actually fill in my not required company form, or company field, or did they leave it blank? So I actually have 2 Zapiers to handle that. As TJ mentioned, there is a new feature that on the trigger itself, you can branch your logic now. This was built before that branching existed. And you can say, oh, if the person filled out the form without the company, follow this path. If the person filled out the form with the company, follow this path. That's brand new in the last like 3 months. So I will be updating these if I think we have the right payment plan to do that. But you can instead, what you can do is build a bunch of Zaps. The way Zapier prices is they only charge you if their Zap finds data or acts upon data. So if I were to actually filter here and stop, I wouldn't get charged much for this Zap, because the Zap didn't do anything. It didn't find any of my data, and it didn't act on my data. So you get charged per step, but it's only steps that are successful in doing something. But you do want to be conscious of that when you're building your Zaps, not to make them too complicated, because they start to get expensive. And then you can create leads, contacts, and you can do this sort of, it's kind of an if-then by going with filters along the way. I don't want to dive in too deep because we're running out of time. I can't see questions. So if there's any, please yell.
There was a question from Michael. What about custom objects?
It can talk to custom objects, yes. Here we'll do a... Am I making that up? Hold on. Sorry. I was just in Workato, so you'll have to, yes, create a custom object.
Workato for custom objects, and obviously, yes. All right.
Sorry, when you work with a lot of tools.
One thing I want to mention, a lot of people like Zapier with MailChimp, since MailChimp's integration sucks. One thing I do want to mention, though, is that Zapier with MailChimp doesn't trigger on edit. So I have a lot of clients that have existing contacts that they'll then get the email for, either direct entry or they'll do an email append, and Zapier will not trigger to put them into MailChimp in those conditions, because it only works on record create. So you'd want a different tool if you have a lot of that type of scenario where you're having contacts being edited to meet the criteria and not on create.
And so that's definitely, TJ, thank you. The thing that I do when I'm starting to investigate Zapier for a project to decide if it's the way we want to go is I will actually create a test account for the client, and I will just start playing with it, because you can use Zaps for free. You can play with Zapier for free forever. It's when you start passing data that you get into pricing plans. But I actually will make a Zap, find the app I care about. Like, say, we just built a complicated Shopify integration. So I'll add Shopify, and I'll start searching for what I'm trying to do. And then that'll let you know really quickly where your limitations are. Like you might, in Shopify, the word is called customer. And there's always a list, but just make sure you keep going down, because a lot of times there's like a show more button down here. But if you just start playing, it's going to give you a good idea of what Zapier can do for you and can't. And then always, of course, email support and put in a feature request, because they actually do build. It's a pretty well developing platform. Stuff gets added pretty often, I found. We all need to remind them to do campaign member search, because that would make life much easier.
That sounds great. Yeah, fantastic. Okay. Go on, TJ and Bill. What was it you wanted to tell us about flows?
Oh, Bill had a question about embedding flows for external access, and you can have a flow. I actually have a client that has a very robust series of flows for a California grant that is embedded in a online community, a Salesforce community. And in one of the most recent releases, it used to be that you'd have to have codes to be able to embed those forms. And in one of the most recent releases, they're opening up Lightning components to be able to just drag and drop into your communities, and flows is one of those. So just create your visual flow, go into your community and drag and drop a Lightning component and your flow, and then just say which flow you want to put in there. So you can, if you have communities are also a great way to gather information that talks directly to Salesforce. Extremely expensive depending on how you're doing it.
I was going to say that might need to be. Yes.
Communities are actually another really great way to open up Salesforce to volunteers or board members, because you can get, I think it's like $15 a year for a dedicated license to a community for that type of thing. So you could open that, you could create a community for those limited users and have them still see access Salesforce, still enter into Salesforce, and you can now use Lightning components really easily in communities and drop in flows and other Lightning components, either from the App Exchange or custom built or something like that.
Yeah, so it's a kind of interesting way to think about it, isn't it? That actually for a smaller number of people that you want quite a lot of detail from, a community may not seem the obvious choice, but it might be the way to go. Whereas when you're collecting information from a lot of people who start off kind of anonymously, and there's lots and lots of them, these form tools probably make more sense from a cost point of view. Yeah, interesting thought. Great, thank you. I think we kind of picked up, there were some questions about which FormAssembly plan, and so let's just confirm the demo that Brennan was showing us, that's the middle one, which is the one that allows you to pre-fill from Salesforce records, but you can also build form pretty much unlimited forms with the first tier plan, which is called Professional. And yes, do, as I think TJ pointed out at some point, with all of these tools, make sure, look out for the non-profit discount, see if they also offer referral things, come and talk to a partner. There's all sorts of ways that, I mean, you can get sticker shock when you look at the prices of any of these tools, can't you? Really, you just need to start asking and digging in, because most of them are pretty generous to nonprofits when you start to ask. Great, thank you very much. We've gone slightly over, as usual, with picking a really big topic. We've done some scratching of the surface, but I hope that that's given people some ideas and some things to think about and to dig in and explore more. And I know that our panel are all extremely active in the hub. So if you have follow-up questions, please post, and I'm sure people will be happy to leap in and answer and share their experience.
And don't forget the consumer reports group in the hub.
Yes, absolutely. This is a very good one to be looking at consumer reports for comparisons on some of these tools. Great, thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed for your time and for the great questions and the contributions. And yeah, we'll follow up with Greg and find out more about the other tool as well. Office Hours will be back with a general session next Friday for general Q&A. Otherwise, thanks again, everybody, and have a wonderful weekend.